Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. This is where I give you some background that you don't get by reading newspapers, monitoring mainstream media, or surfing the net. The first thing I've been thinking about is the 3 kidnapped boys and their terrible tragedy, their brutal murder, and the families of these angels of sorts. Right now, they're just getting up from Shiva, which is the traditional initial 7 days of mourning. Their lives are forever altered, as are ours. We will remember where we were when we heard the tragic news that the bodies of the boys were finally found. In many ways, it was a crisis that was so visceral, so personal, but it was also national. Like the Kennedy assassination, like the shuttle explosion. But for the Jewish community, it was like the Rabin assassination. We will always remember because it was personal and national at the same time. More on this idea later. But first, I want to talk about Iraq. What's going on in Iraq right now is mind-boggling. One has to first understand some basic terms. One of the classic terms that's being used right now is ISIS, the Islamic Army of Iraq and Syria. Well, it really isn't the Islamic Army of Iraq and Syria. It's actually the Islamic Army of the Levant. Why? Because it really includes, the Arabic word is al-Sham. Al-Sham includes Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Cyprus, Jordan, and Israel, or in their terms, Palestine. What happens here is very important because this group of people who are now taking over major swaths of these countries are there to announce now that they have become independent. They're an independent state. They've changed their name from ISIS to simply IS, the Islamic State. Islamic State under a leader, a caliph. His name is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Now, this character himself, we don't see a lot of pictures of him, but we have a few from current issues and a few from when he was in prison in Iraq itself. But what happens is that this movement is not just some minor break-off from Al-Qaeda. Right now, he's trying to say, and this is what it means to declare an Islamic State, and that he is the leader, the caliph of that state. It's a caliphate. That means that what he's done right now is he says that all Muslims must genuflect towards him, that his group and his movement is the centerpiece of all of Islam. And hence what we have now is an internal struggle within Islam. So critical is this, so essential is this, is that people who question him will fundamentally be murdered, executed. And that's the rationale used for these massive beheadings, crucifixions even. In Syria the other day, 8 people who questioned him, not because they were Shiites, because they were Sunnis, but questioning that movement, were crucified and left publicly on their crosses for days for people to see. It's not just about intimidation. It's about a question of whether or not you will, when you question them, when you question him, when you question this new Islamic caliphate, what your ultimate end will be. It's a swift sword, he calls it, and that is truly scary. It's scary because in the world in which we live, in the Western world, we're not used to this kind of response. How do we resolve these issues? How do we confront such horror? Well, one option, and the first option which is critical for us to even look at, is to create a Kurdish state in the north of Iraq. Why is that important? Because that's an independent state naturally. The Kurds have been independent. They've taken over Kirkuk also, which means it's a major oil center. They are exporting oil. They're on their own. They want a state of their own in the first place. Now, granted, there are other Kurds that don't just live in Iraq. They live in Turkey and Syria and some even in Iran. But the idea is to create that state and just cut it off and create an independent state of Turkey. The next thing, though, is you have to attack these leaders of the Islamic State from the air. You've got to cut off the heads of these leaders. It's, in many ways, it's a metaphor of the snake. They will grow back. There will be new leaders, as Baghdadi is one of those new leaders. But it ultimately rips out fundamentally their infrastructure because they need leaders to genuflect to. They need to feel as if they're being led by a leader, a powerful, charismatic leader. So we have to target those. In addition, the next thing is nothing could happen. Nothing could happen without tribal leaders, the tribal leaders in the region. That means that what we have to do is we, the West, has to pay, bribe, convince those tribal leaders to move back towards traditional Iraqi leadership and away from this Baghdadi and the Al-Qaeda breakoff called ISIS or the Islamic State. If we don't do that, if the West does not do that, and it's not an expensive venture, Iraq will fall, and it will fall into total chaos. You would ask, well, what's the big deal? It's far away from us, out of sight, out of mind. It matters. It matters for the security of Israel. And for that, it matters for the whole Jewish community. And that's critical for us to see. In addition to that, it matters, if only for the price of oil. Because when crises happen around oil, you know and have to know and understand that the price of oil is going to go up. Just look at the map of Iraq and you'll see what's going on. You'll see how we play the game out. In the map of Iraq, you can actually see that, let's say, for instance, in the east of Iraq, you have Syria. You have, that's in the northeast of Iraq. That's the Kurdish area. You have Turkey to the west. You have Jordan to the west. You have Saudi Arabia to the southwest. You have Kuwait in a tiny little area in the south. Understanding the map will help us understand the conflict itself. How is this connected to the West? The Jewish community has to realize that we are deeply connected to Israel. And if Iraq falls and Islamic leadership takes over there, it means fundamentally one of their major targets will be Israel. And to not understand that is to not understand what their ultimate objectives are. We see that in Syria. When the Islamic groups who are fighting one another choose to turn away from their own fighting and fight elsewhere, they start lobbing rockets at Israel. And that's a deep problem. The next topic I want to talk about has to deal with incentivizing terror. Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, is doing something that we've known about for years, but we didn't know the figures. Why are the figures so critical? Because they boggle the mind. Naftali Bennett, a minister in the Israeli government, came out with precisely the numbers the other day. And when I read them, I had to double check. I couldn't believe that they were true. What he said is that the Palestinian Authority spends about 44 million shekel a month paying prisoners who are in prison itself. Okay, but that's not the point. The point is, the worse your terror, the worse you've been convicted for, the worse your punishment, the longer time you've been convicted to stay in Israeli prisons, the more money you get. For instance, 0 to 10 years, you get 4,000 shekel a month. 10 to 15 years, 6,000 shekel a month. 25 to 30 years, 10,000 shekel a month. 30 years, you're convicted of 30 years, you get 12,000 shekel a month. Each prisoner gets 400 shekel twice a year for incidentals. Now, when you compare that to the salary of a Palestinian police person, they make 2,700 a month. So obviously, the question has to be asked. It begs the question. It seems to be more efficient monetarily to perpetrate terror. Because when you perpetrate terror, you get paid better. And not only that, the worse the terror, the more horrific the attack, the more years you're convicted, the more money you get. So the Palestinian Authority is actually incentivizing, they're creating a situation where they're paying people to perpetrate terror. So in the end, you should know where that money comes from. It just doesn't come from taxes. It comes from aid, because most of the budget of the Palestinian Authority comes from foreign aid. And who gives that foreign aid? You and I. The West, the United States. The United States gives about just under $1 billion a year in aid to the Palestinian Authority. We have to stop that. It needs to end. We cannot be in a situation where we incentivize terror. Up next, points of view. I've been looking at interesting columns, op-eds, editorials to discover other people's points of view. Here are some important voices that have been talking about various issues that are important to me, at least. And so I think it might be important to tell you about them also. What I want to know now is I want to try to explain to you a comparison between the Wall Street Journal op-ed by Tzipi Livni, Israel's Minister of Justice, called 3 Boys, 1 Terrorist Group, and a Message for Democracies. It was published on June 26, 2014. And compare that to Fathi Albis, a regular columnist in El Hayat Al Jadida, which is the mainstream journal, daily news of the Palestinian Authority. It was published on June 23rd, 2014, and it was called It's All Because of Israel. Now, understanding the role of Al Hayat is to understand it's the mouthpiece of what the Palestinian Authority leadership wants their people and the Arabic-speaking world to know. So you have to get that context before we understand the pieces themselves. Livni is the Minister of Justice of Israel. She's the former foreign minister. She's a lawyer. Actually, surprisingly, she's also a former Mossad agent. I don't know them giving away a deep secret there. She was actually a team leader in Europe during her days as a law student. She is currently also not just the Minister of Justice, she's the chief Israeli negotiator with the Palestinians. In her piece, she describes the dangers of Hamas. She shows how their charter quotes and cites the protocols of the elders of Zion. That's Hamas. In other words, a part of their charter, their raison d'etre, the reason why they exist, they bring out this lie from the Russian secret police. That's insightful. She challenges the democratic principles of granting every party democratic power. Because, after all now, Hamas is a part of the Palestinian unity government. They're included in the democracy. That's troubling for her, as it should be, she says, for all democracies. Because just because you exist in the democracy doesn't mean that you should have an equal footing. Only democratic parties should have standing in democratic procedures. That's what she's really getting at. She concludes with the following statements. The challenge posed by Hamas is part of the danger faced across the region, with the unprecedented advance of forces who envision a Middle East inimical to democratic ideals and the prospects of peace. In Iraq, in Syria, Iran, Lebanon, and elsewhere, the enemies of democracy are determined to exploit every opportunity to press forward. And that's how she ends. And that is, for me, the essence of an understanding of why a democratic principle of simple voting and parties is not across the board, that you have to ultimately ferret them out. Non-democratic forces should not be involved in democracy. The next op-ed that I want to talk about actually comes from Al Hayat Al Jadida. Fathi Albis, he writes this. Now remember what the concept is. He's blaming Israel for everything. And here's how he says it, and this is the quote, and it's truly insightful in terms of the way in which the Palestinian Authority would view, see, and understand what's happening in the world. He says, quote, "The region around us is burning. The abhorrent sectarianism, wars in Iraq and Syria are burning everything. Israel is a product of myth racism, and war believes that the conflagration in the region gives it free hand and respite. Its leaders forget that these flames are burning because of it and will be directed towards it in the end." He concludes with the following statement, and this truly makes bumps go up and down my back. "The bloodthirsty helmet-clad rifle-bearing soldier," this is the Israeli soldier he's speaking of, armor-clad, rifle-bearing soldier out of self-deception that this is the way to protect his existence and security. But that soldier of the helmet will not win and will continue to live in fear. What he's saying, and what ultimately is being said by this particular columnist, is he's saying that all the problems that exist in the Middle East are caused by Israel. And that all the conflicts that happen, whether it be in Iraq or in Syria or in Lebanon, or anywhere for that matter, is all because of Israel's oppression of the Palestinian. Now you would say, how does he come to that? Any free-thinking, normal-thinking, analytical thinking person could obviously say, if the Palestinians and the Israelis came to a peace agreement tomorrow, would that solve the problem in Iraq today? No, of course not. Would Iran suddenly throw up their objectives for nuclear weapons and technology? Of course not. Would the Syrians suddenly put down their weapons and live in peace with one another if only the Palestinians and the Israelis got together? Of course. It's a total exaggeration. It's a misunderstanding. What it is it's a part of a narrative. The narrative says that the most important issue in today's world, in the Middle East, is not the lives and deaths of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed over the last year, but rather it's a question of the Palestinians and the Israeli oppressor. And that's what the columnist is saying. And honestly, it's a common theme, and it's frightening in many ways. The second column I want to talk to you about is by a character named Khalid al-Kazzaz. Kazzaz writes a piece called Imprisoned by Egypt's Military. It was printed in the New York Times, June 28th, and he asks, why and what happened? How could the world stand silent in the face of Morsi's arrest? What happens, for those of you that just to give some context, it went something like this. About a year ago, Morsi, who was elected the year before to become the first democratically elected president of Egypt, was ousted. He was ousted over the July 4th weekend, actually. What's interesting about this whole notion is not that he was ousted. It was that Morsi himself was elected as a member and representative of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this actually goes to the very question that Tzipi Livni was asking in her piece. How on earth could a group like the Muslim Brotherhood, which was non-democratic, even stand for election? But they were elected in Egypt. And then comes El-Sisi and the military, and they oust Morsi. And by ousting them, they're trying to put in place a new democratic procedure. And right now, that new democracy is in place. It's really a laboratory of sorts. We don't know what will happen in the end, but they're trying to work these things out. Will it happen? I don't know. But the columnist comes out and says something else. He begins by saying this: in a few days, I will complete a year of imprisonment. I was the note taker for the, just in parentheses, I was for the Foreign Relations Secretary of Morsi himself. And he was arrested with 8 other staff members together with Morsi. They decided to stay with him. He wouldn't have been arrested had he not stayed with Morsi. He probably could have gotten out of the country and everything else, but he decided to do that. And he goes on to say, he says, we were elected. We were trying to change things. And then the quote is something like this: why are you so silent about me? And indeed, he means about those who were arrested, Morsi, and the ousting of a democratic party, a democratically elected party. Here's the answer. The answer is that you were a party of the Muslim Brotherhood, and you created fear in Egypt. You were ultimately creating an anarchy, creating an Islamic state. And the West, even though you got this essay smuggled out of your prison cell, published into the New York Times, asking and pulling at the heartstrings of Americans who are reading it, the West is afraid of Islamic societies. They're afraid of the Islamic State. They're afraid of ISIS. They're afraid of this because they fundamentally believe that that could potentially become targets. They could potentially become targets of the anger and the ire of Islamic society. In a moment, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. This segment is called Commentary Through Cartoons. It's where we look at and discuss creative, powerful, and insightful cartoons. Some cartoons make me laugh and some make me furious. Two of the ones we're going to look at right now make me furious, and I'm sure they're going to make you furious also. The first one portrays the Palestinians who have kidnapped these Israeli boys. Now, when the cartoon is drawn, the boys have not been found yet, and it's not clear that they've been killed, murdered by these Hamas terrorists. But what it does is it makes a play which is dramatically different than, let's say, for instance, you would normally have in a normal cartoon, because they're playing on the most critical and popular thing that's happening today in the world. The most critical and popular thing today in the world is the World Cup. Now, the World Cup is taking place in Brazil, and the model of the World Cup is this ball, which is really created by hands. And it looks like a trophy or a soccer ball being held by hands. The cartoon that I want to talk about is a play on that. What it does is it has these hands, but dangling from the hands is the perverse and ugly symbol of 3 Israeli boys, those that were kidnapped and since murdered. And the interesting thing about this is that this was not some private cartoon that was made by people who were throwing it up on their Facebook page. This was actually produced, created, paid for, and published in the mainstream paper of El Hayat Al Jadida, the main Palestinian Authority paper. This is right out of the Der Stürmer. This is a symbol right out of the anti-Semitic symbols of the Nazi past. It's mind-boggling to think that people would find this in the least but humorous or insightful. It's perverse. It's ugly. It's worse than ugly. You see, because murder is wrong. And that includes all forms of murder. Murder of children is wrong. And there's no justification for it, whether they be Arab or Jew. And that actually goes into the very same question with regard to the Palestinian teen that was murdered in Israel. That is wrong. And the Prime Minister of Israel came out and condemned it, as did the family of those victims, those Israeli Jewish teens' families came out and condemned it also. Because they said this does not, and is not supposed to happen. Cold-blooded murder is beyond the fold. It just doesn't exist. It should not happen. Now, the next thing is that there's a spectacular piece on the website or the Facebook page of the Palestinian Authority. Now, from our point of view, the symbol of the Palestinians has always been the V for victory. It's the peace sign in the West, but it's the victory sign around in the Palestinian world. The Fatah Facebook page, when these boys were kidnapped, was transformed, and they actually transformed it to the 3 symbol finger raise, as opposed to the 2 symbol finger raised. Obviously, V for victory, 3 for the 3 kidnapped soldiers. You've got to ask, why are they doing this? Are they embracing this? This is an idea which deeply troubles me. It's one thing when the break-off group or a set of individuals do something. It's one thing, and to claim they do, by the way, which is what the Palestinian Authority claimed in words, that it wasn't necessarily the groups of organized Palestinian Authority or Hamas-linked people. It was rather a break-up group. A break-up group are individuals. They should be condemned. But it's another thing when your official policies and your official publications are producing this kind of material. That's just downright ridiculous. It's the difference also with regard to the murder of this Palestinian teen in Israel. It's not about a group that did it or an official group that embraced it. Official groups reject it. Official leaders reject it. Even the parents of victims reject it. That revenge is not a place and has no place in this kind of world. It is not. The book of Psalms discusses it. The book of Psalms in Psalm 94 says it very clearly. God is vengeful. We must pursue justice. And that's a whole different world. There's a third cartoon which shows Israeli soldiers. This one comes also from the Facebook page of the Palestinian Authority, but not simply the Palestinian Authority, it's rather their security forces. The Facebook page shows a map of Israel and a group of Israeli soldiers with perverse noses, humongous Jewish noses, and they're searching for the boys. And they're trampling on keffiyehs, which is that checkered black and white and red and white striped, red and white checkered headdress that is traditional to the region. They're trouncing on Korans, and with their huge noses, they're marching all over the map trying to find these boys. And the turrets in the background of the map, there are turrets, the sort of like Dentos symbols, are on the map itself, which really symbolizes Hebron. Why do they have such a thing there? What's it doing? Why have it? It doesn't make much sense. But what it does say is they could just have the symbols of the Israelis with Stars of David on their helmets. They didn't have to have those noses, but they do. In a moment, thoughts and predictions. Here are my thoughts, my opinions, my ideas about what's happening and what will happen in the future. Israel is pleading with the United States to not make the kind of agreement that they expect the United States will make with Iran. You see, right now, the United States is eager to come to a conclusion for the July 20th deadline to agree with Iran to make everything look hunky-dory and fine. But the reality is that it's not going to be a good agreement. Why? And how do I know this? I know this because Iran knows it too. Iran has the upper hand. They want as much as they can for as little. And the United States wants that agreement by July 20th. There might be an extension, maybe a week, maybe 3 weeks or 4 weeks, maybe right into August. But that's not the point. Israel is coming to the United States and asking, please don't sign on any conditions. Maybe create a situation where it's similar to the Syrian agreement, where you limit uranium to 3.5%. But stand up, don't give in, don't capitulate to the Iranians. Because the Iranians up there have the leverage right now, because they know that you want the deal. I want to explain what happened at the African Union Summit in Equatorial Guinea. The president was the host, and he invited the Jewish delegation to come and visit. Now, what was shocking to me is that the delegation was expelled. Do you know why they were expelled? They were expelled because they were supposed to begin the whole event with a moment dedicated to the Israeli boys. And in the end, the Arab League discovered that was going to happen, and they said they would not enter if the Jews were still there. In the end, the Jewish delegation had to leave before the African summit continued. That to me is shocking. But I will tell you, heads will roll diplomatically because of it. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@shalomtv.com. For those of you who tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. And before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that this week, in 1927, Henry Ford retracted and apologized for publishing the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? Now, he did this because of public pressure, economic pressure. Economic pressure works, even today, but it worked for Henry Ford. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on Shalom TV.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.